The kind of morning that doesn't let you sleep in. Not when your hip is acting up and the coffee maker is already hissing from the kitchen and the sun is coming through the blinds at that particular angle that hits you right in the eyes, no matter which way you turn your head. I was 63 years old, 2 years out of the army, and I was standing in my kitchen in Fort Worth, Texas, holding a wooden box the size of a shoebox that I had never seen before in my life. My mother's lawyer had handed it to me 4 days ago, right after the reading of the will. My brother Richard got the house in Amarillo. The one with the wraparound porch and the 3-car garage and the half-acre of land that backed up against a dry creek bed. He'd been talking about that house since we were teenagers. He got it. My sister Donna got the investment accounts. 42 years of my mother saving $10 here, $20 there, every birthday check she never spent on herself, every Christmas bonus she squirreled away instead of buying herself something nice. The accounts had grown to something Donna described as more than comfortable. She said it with a smile that she tried to hide but didn't. I got the box. The lawyer slid it across the conference table like he was apologizing without using words. It was old. The wood was dark and slightly warped on one corner, and the brass latch had gone green with age. There was no key. There was a small handwritten note taped to the lid with a piece of yellowed tape, and the note said, in my mother's handwriting, "For Thomas. He will know what to do." Richard looked at it and then looked at me and said, "Well, that's about right." Donna said nothing. She was already folding her copy of the estate documents. I carried the box to my truck. I drove home. I set it on the kitchen counter. And for 4 days, I did not open it. I don't know exactly why. Part of it was grief, I think. My mother had passed in October, quietly, the way she had done most things in her life, without making a fuss, without asking for anything, just here one day and gone the next. She was 81. She had lived alone in that house in Amarillo for 11 years after my father died, and in all that time, I was the one who drove out there every other month to check on the gutters and Richard came at Christmas. Donna called on birthdays. I'm not saying that to make myself sound like a good son. I'm saying it because it's true and because it matters to the rest of what happened. The other part of why I didn't open the box was that I was a little afraid of what was inside. My mother was not a dramatic woman. She did not leave mysterious boxes for dramatic effect. If she had put something in a locked box and written a note saying I would know what to do, she meant it seriously. And I wasn't sure I was ready to be trusted with whatever that was. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there was a man standing on my front step. He was in his mid-70s, lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and the posture of someone who had never once in his life allowed himself to slouch. He was wearing a plain blue button-down shirt and dark slacks, civilian clothes, but there was something about the way he stood that told you immediately this was not a man who had spent his life behind a desk. He looked at me and said, "Are you Thomas Calloway?" I said I was. He said, "My name is Gerald Marsh. I served with your father in Vietnam. I've been trying to find you for about 3 weeks." He paused. "I heard about your mother. I'm sorry for your loss." Another pause. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll hear me out before you decide whether to answer." I stepped back and told him to come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd been sitting alone for 4 days, with that wooden box on the counter behind me. He accepted a cup of coffee. He held it with both hands, the way men of a certain age do, not drinking it right away, just holding it. He said, "Has anyone opened the box yet?" I turned and looked at the box. Then I looked back at him. I said, "How do you know about the box?" He said, "Because your mother called me 8 months ago and told me she was going to leave it to you. She wanted me to make sure you opened it." He set down his coffee. "She was worried you'd be too stubborn or too sad or too busy to deal with it. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, Thomas puts other people's problems before his own. Someone will have to push him." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, She wasn't wrong. Gerald Marsh looked at the box on the counter. He said, "Your father gave that box to your mother in 1971, right before his second deployment. He told her to keep it until the time was right. She kept it for 52 years. He let that sit in the air for a second. I think it's time." I got up. I brought the box to the table. The brass latch was stiff. I worked it with my thumbnail for a moment, and then it gave, and the lid came open, and inside was not what I expected. There was no money, no jewelry, no documents from a bank or a lawyer. There was a folded piece of paper, old and soft with age, and underneath it, a photograph, and underneath the photograph, a small leather pouch no bigger than my fist, cinched closed with a drawstring. I unfolded the paper first. It was a letter, written in my father's handwriting, which I recognized immediately, the same slanted print he used on birthday cards, the same way he made his capital T's, with a long flat bar that always extended too far to the left. The letter was dated the 14th of March, 1971. "Eleanor, if you're reading this before I come home, then you know what it means and I don't have to say it. If you're reading this after, then I want you to know that I meant everything. The land in the letter is real. The deed is in the pouch. It's 11 acres outside Kerrville, in the hill country. My Uncle Fletcher sold it to me for $800 in 1968, and I never told you because I wanted it to be something I gave you when the time was right. I never found the right time. Give it to the one who stayed. You'll know which one that is." I had to stop reading. I set the letter down on the table and I put my hand over my eyes and I sat there for a moment with Gerald Marsh across from me, not saying anything, being quiet the way good men are when someone needs a minute. My father had died in 1998. I was 35 years old. He had never mentioned land in the hill country. He had never mentioned 11 acres or a deed or any of this. For 25 years, my mother had been holding a wooden box with a land deed inside it and a letter that said, "Give it to the one who stayed." And she had given it to me. I took a breath. I opened the leather pouch. The deed was inside, soft and creased from 50 years of folding. The land was registered to Franklin Dale Calloway. 11.3 acres, Kerr County, Texas. There was also a smaller folded paper, a tax assessment from 2019, which meant my mother had been quietly paying property taxes on that land for decades without ever telling anyone. I looked at Gerald Marsh. I said, "Did she ever consider selling it?" He said, "I asked her that once. She said she was waiting for the right person to have it. She said she didn't want it to go to someone who would just sell it. She wanted it to go to someone who understood what your father meant when he bought it." He picked up his coffee again. "She said you were the only one of her children who ever sat still long enough to understand anything." I laughed at that. I don't know where the laugh came from. It was a wet, surprised kind of laugh that comes out when something is both funny and devastating at the same time. I said, "Richard is going to have something to say about this." Gerald Marsh said, "I imagine he will." He was right. I called Richard that evening, after Gerald Marsh had left. I told him about the box. I told him about the letter and the deed and the 11 acres outside Kerrville. I was as straightforward about it as I knew how to be. I told him exactly what the letter said, including the part about "give it to the one who stayed." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not fair." I said, "I know it doesn't feel that way." He said, "She had land this whole time and she never told us." "She sat on a land deed for 50 years?" I said. "She was waiting for the right time." "That's what the letter says." He said, "And she decided the right time was after she was dead, when she couldn't even explain herself." I didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't wrong, exactly. It wasn't fair in the way that things are supposed to be fair, divided equally, 1/3 each, clean and simple. But my mother hadn't been trying to be clean and simple. She'd been trying to honor what my father had written in 1971. Give it to the one who stayed. Richard had not stayed. That wasn't a criticism. It was just a fact. He had moved to Dallas at 22 and built a life there and came home when he could. Donna had married young and moved to Phoenix and called when she remembered. That was the shape of our family. Nobody was a villain. Everybody had just lived their own life. I had lived mine too, but my life had included driving to Amarillo every other month for 11 years, and fixing the gutters, and sitting at the kitchen table. I hadn't done it to earn anything. I want to be clear about that. I did it because she was my mother and she was alone and it was the right thing to do. I never expected anything in return. I wouldn't have asked for it. But my father had thought about this in 1971, before I was old enough to understand what a land deed was, and he had told my mother to give it to the one who stayed. And she had watched for 52 years to see which one that would be. The call with Richard ended without resolution. He said he needed to think. I said that was fine. I sat in my living room in the dark for a while after I hung up, not watching television, not reading, just sitting. I thought about my father, Franklin Dale Calloway. He had enlisted in 1965, served 2 tours in Vietnam, come home in 1973, and gone to work for a pipe-fitting company in Amarillo for the next 25 years. He was not a man who talked about his feelings or his plans or his fears. He was a man who fixed things when they broke, and showed up when he was needed, and very rarely asked for anything. I had thought about him every day since he died. Not dramatically. Just the way you think about someone who shaped you in small moments, when you're doing something ordinary, and you realize he's the reason you do it that way. He had bought 11 acres in the hill country when he was 24 years old, with money he probably shouldn't have spent, and he had carried that deed through a war and through 25 years of ordinary life, and he had never once mentioned it. I didn't know whether to feel awed by that or heartbroken. Maybe both. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. The next morning, Gerald Marsh called. He said, "I want to tell you something about your father, if you'll let me." Something I should have told you a long time ago. I said, "I'm listening." He said he and my father had served together in the same unit outside Quang Tri in 1971. He said, "My father was the kind of man that other men oriented themselves around without fully realizing they were doing it, the kind of man who could be completely calm in a situation that should have been terrifying, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he understood that staying calm was the job." He said, "My father saved his life twice in 13 months, once in a way that could be documented and once in a way that couldn't." He said, "The one that couldn't be documented was the more important one. It was just a conversation. The kind of conversation where someone looks at you in a specific moment and says exactly what you need to hear." I was 22 years old, and I was not in a good place, and your father sat with me for 2 hours one night, and he didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He didn't give me a speech. He just talked to me like I was worth talking to. Like I mattered. Like there was something worth going home for. He paused. I went home. I've had a good life. I owe him for that. I said he never told me any of this. Gerald Marsh said he wouldn't have. That was how he was. I thought about the land deed in the leather pouch on my kitchen counter. $800 in 1968. A young man buying land for a future he hadn't built yet, for a family he hadn't made yet, carrying the deed through a war because he intended to come home and do something with it, something good. He came home. He made the family. He just never found the right time to say it. I drove out to Kerrville that weekend. Alone. I'd looked up the parcel on the county assessor's website and found it a rectangle of land on a county road about 6 miles outside town, mostly cedar and live oak from what I could tell from the satellite view, backing up against a dry creek bed that probably ran in spring. I parked on the shoulder of the county road and walked the fence line. It was late November, and the cedars were still green, and the live oaks had gone the color of dark honey, and the sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in Texas in the fall, a deep, clean blue that goes all the way up. There was nobody else around. Just the wind and the birds and the crunch of dry grass under my boots. I walked the whole perimeter. It took about 40 minutes. The land was rough and cedar-choked and not particularly beautiful in any formal sense, but it was land. Solid ground under my feet. ground that had belonged to my father in 1968 and had been quietly waiting ever since. I stood at the north end of the property for a long time looking south, toward a low ridge where a cluster of live oaks grew close together, and the grass was thicker, and the light came through the branches at a low angle and spread across the ground in long, thin ribbons. My father had stood here. Not necessarily at this exact spot, but somewhere on this ground, at 24 years old, and thought, this is worth something. This is worth holding on to. I thought about the box on my counter, the letter in his handwriting, the flat bars on the capital T's, the part where he said I never found the right time. I thought, I know exactly how that feels. On the drive back to Fort Worth, I called Richard. He answered on the third ring. He said, I was wondering when you were going to call. I said, I drove out to the land today. He was quiet. I said, I want to talk to you and Donna both. Not on the phone. I want to come to Dallas next weekend if you're willing, and I want us to sit down together and talk about this properly. I paused. Not to fight about it. I'm not interested in fighting about it. I want to figure out what the right thing to do is. And I think we should do that together. Another silence. Then Richard said, okay. I said, okay. We met on a Saturday in late November at Richard's house in Dallas. His wife Michelle had made a pot of coffee and then tactfully decided to take the kids to the park. Donna had driven up from Austin. She'd moved from Phoenix 3 years ago. We sat at Richard's kitchen table, the three of us, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I told them everything. The letter, word for word. Gerald Marsh's visit. What Marsh had told me about our father in Vietnam. The drive to Kerrville. The live oaks on the ridge. I told them about the property taxes, how our mother had paid them quietly for decades, never complaining, never mentioning the land to either of them, just steadily maintaining something she had been asked to hold. Donna started crying quietly about halfway through. Not dramatically. Just tears running down her face while she held her coffee cup. When I was done, Richard said, I didn't know any of that. About Vietnam. About Marsh. I said, neither did I, until 4 days ago. He said, Dad never talked about it. I said no. Richard looked at the table for a while. Then he said, I'm sorry I said it wasn't fair. I said, it's okay. I understood what you meant. He said, no, it's not okay. I was thinking about myself. About what I was getting or not getting. I wasn't thinking about what Mom was actually doing or why. He shook his head slowly. She paid property taxes on 11 acres for 40 years and never said a word. Because Dad asked her to hold it for the right person. He looked up at me. That's not nothing. That's enormous, Donna said through her tears. She never complained once. Not once in 40 years about anything he asked her to do. I didn't say anything. I just let it sit there. The three of us were quiet for a while. Outside, through the kitchen window, I could see a tree in Richard's backyard, bare-limbed in November, and somewhere down the street, someone was running a leaf blower, and the sound was ordinary and distant and somehow exactly right for the moment. Richard said, What are you going to do with it? I said, I've been thinking about that. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. I don't want to sell it. That's the only thing I know for sure. Dad bought it and held it, and Mom held it for 50 years. Selling it feels like losing something that was always supposed to be kept. Richard nodded slowly. I said, I've been thinking about a cabin. Nothing big. Just something simple. Somewhere we could go. All of us. I looked at him and then at Donna. I'm not trying to own it by myself. I know the deed has my name on it, and I know Dad's letter said what it said. But it's still family land. It's still your father's land, too. Richard looked at me for a long moment. He said, Thomas. I said, yeah. He said, you've been taking care of things your whole life. You drove to Amarillo every other month for 11 years. You showed up. Every time something needed doing, you were the one who did it." He stopped. His voice had gone thick. "I don't think I ever told you that I noticed." That I was grateful. He put his hand on the table, not quite reaching across, just there. "I noticed. I should have said it a long time ago. I didn't trust myself to speak right away." I just nodded. Donna reached over and put her hand over mine. She said, "Mom knew exactly what she was doing. She always knew." She was right. My mother had known. For 52 years, she had been watching and waiting and holding something precious until she was sure she knew where it should go. She hadn't been punishing Richard or Donna. She hadn't been playing favorites. She had been honoring a promise she made to a young man in 1971 who had written her a letter before going back to a war and said, "Give it to the one who stayed." She had kept that promise with a patience and a quietness that I was only now beginning to fully understand. That was her inheritance to me, I think. Not the land, exactly. The land was my father's gift. But the way she had held it with dignity, without complaint, without ever once using it as leverage or resentment or proof that she deserved more that was hers. That was what she had given me. Gerald Marsh called me a week later. He said he'd been thinking about the land and whether I had any plans. I told him what I'd told Richard and Donna. The cabin. Keeping it in the family. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have liked that." I said, "I hope so." He said, "Thomas, I want to tell you something. When I came to your door, I wasn't sure what I was going to find. Your mother had described you to me, but people aren't always what they're described as." He paused. "You're exactly what she described. She said you were the kind of person who does the right thing without needing to be seen doing it." "That's the rarest thing there is." I said I didn't know about that. He said, "I do. I've been alive long enough to know." We broke ground on the cabin the following spring. Nothing grand. 2 bedrooms, a covered porch facing the live oak ridge, a small stone fireplace. Richard came down 3 weekends to help with the framing. Donna drove up from Austin with her husband and her youngest daughter and spent a Saturday pulling cedar stumps. There was a moment, late in the afternoon on the last day of framing, when the walls were up and the roof structure was in place and the sun was going down behind the ridge and sending long red light across the ground. Richard and I were standing on the porch with cold bottles of water and not talking. After a while he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" He said, "That letter." The way he wrote it. He was 24 years old and he was about to go back to Vietnam, and he was thinking about land and family and the right time. He shook his head. "I think about the things I was worried about at 24 and I feel ashamed." I said, "Don't." "He was an unusual person." Richard said, "He raised you." I didn't answer that. I just looked out at the ridge, at the live oaks in the last light, and thought about a young man from Amarillo who had bought 11 acres because he intended to come home and build something worth having. He had come home. And across 50 years and a wooden box and a letter written in slanted print with capital T's that extended too far to the left, he had built something. Not the cabin. Not exactly. Something harder to name and harder to lose. The cabin has a small sign above the door. It was Donna's idea, and she was right to insist on it. The sign says, "Franklin's Place." Nothing else. Just that. Sometimes when I drive out there alone, in the early morning before the family arrives, I make a cup of coffee and sit on the porch and look at the ridge. The creek runs in April, a thin silver line through the cedar. The live oaks have gone every color that live oaks go, depending on the season, and the sky above them is always that particular Texas blue that goes all the way up. I think about my father. I think about my mother sitting alone in that house in Amarillo for 11 years, paying property taxes on land she never visited, keeping a promise to a man who had trusted her with it. I think about Gerald Marsh standing on my front step in Fort Worth on a Tuesday morning, asking whether I had opened the box. I think about the things we carry for each other, the promises we make and keep in silence, without recognition, without anyone knowing to say thank you. The way a family can hold something across decades, not money, not property, not any physical thing, but something more like trust, more like the memory of who someone was when they were at their best. My father wrote in that letter that he never found the right time. I understand that. I have thought my whole life that I would say certain things when the time was right, do certain things when I was ready, make certain calls I kept putting off. He didn't get the right time. My mother got 52 years and used them the only way she knew how, quietly, faithfully, without fanfare. I'm 63 years old. I have time, I think. Not unlimited time, but enough. Enough to build something. Enough to stay. I am still learning what he meant when he bought this land. I think that's the point. I think that's exactly what he intended, that it would take a lifetime to understand, and that understanding it would be the gift. Not the land. The understanding. That's the inheritance. The most faithful thing a person can do is carry someone else's hope quietly, without applause, without a deadline. Thomas's father bought land he might never return to. His mother paid taxes on it for 40 years without a word. Neither of them needed to be seen doing it. That kind of love doesn't announce itself, it just stays. And one day, when the box finally opens, you understand. The people who stayed were never forgotten. They were simply trusted most. A small note worth sharing: this story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment and leave you with something warm to carry into your day.